Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We're just taking a minute or two just before we start to make sure everyone is settled. And I also just want to make sure that all of our online speakers can hear us. And we will just be taking one moment before we start formally. So I would ask everyone to please take their seats, and we'll make a start very, very shortly. And in the meantime, I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. I am Jean-Paul Adam. I'm the Director for Policy Monitoring and Advocacy in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, welcoming you this morning. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us for the global launch of the 2025 Osaa'S Flagship reports, which includes the report on the causes of conflict and the report on financing for development in terms of particularly strengthening the national and international architectures for financing for development. Before I proceed, I would just like to make sure that our online speakers are connected and that everything is okay for us to proceed. Welcome, Marie-Antoinette. I can see you on screen. Thanks for bearing with us just while we make sure that we have everyone.
Good morning, Jean-Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be starting immediately. Thank you so much for your patience just while we made those confirmations. And just to welcome everyone once again to this launch event. And we will be starting straight away with a special message from the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, who will be sharing her thoughts with us on the occasion of the launches of these reports. So if I could immediately go to the screening of the message. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to join you for the launch of Osaa'S 2025 flagship reports. Let me begin by commending my sister Christina and the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa for its steadfast leadership in advancing Africa's peace and development agenda, and for producing two timely and insightful reports on strengthening state capacity for peace and development in Africa and reforming the global financing architecture to support Africa's sustainable development. These two reports come at a defining moment as the international community works to accelerate progress on the African Union's Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. They remind us that peace and development are inseparable. Peace cannot hold where poverty and inequality persist, and development cannot endure where governance is weak or institutions fail to deliver justice and opportunity. They make the case that durable peace depends on capable states, strong institutions, and inclusive governance. When public services reach those furthest behind, when livelihoods are secured, and when the rule of law protects all equally, societies become more cohesive and peace becomes self-sustaining. They also call for a global system that serves Africa's priorities and potential, one that echoes the Secretary General's call for an international financial architecture that is fair, inclusive, and fit for purpose, one that delivers debt relief, expands fiscal space, and channels investment into people and planet. Together, they highlight a powerful truth. Sustainable development and sustainable peace both rest on strong, effective, and trusted institutions. Institutions are not mere structures. They are the backbone of the social contract. They build confidence in government, give coherence to policy, and transform ambition into results that people can see and can feel in their lives. This is why the severe commitment underscores the importance of domestic resource mobilization as the foundation of a sustainable financing system. DRM is not simply about raising revenue. It is about building predictable financial flows, strengthening governance, and de-risking SDG investments so that financing becomes equitable, transparent, and resilient. The linkage is clear. Peace requires institutions that deliver development. Sustainable development requires sustainable financing, and sustainable financing depends on institutions that mobilize resources and build trust. Excellencies, this is a value chain that connects Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda, Africa's vision and the world's promise. Together, they call for capable states, global solidarity, and partnerships that empower rather than constrain. Let's use these flagship reports to advance a future of durable peace, sustainable development, and justice for Africa and for all. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Deputy Secretary General for having shared this message with us on the occasion of the launch of the reports, and for situating these reports in the context of the very important work that the United Nations is currently undertaking, and particularly through the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. These reports are critical for the partnership between the African Union and the United Nations, and they are situated as vehicles to accelerate the attainment of Agenda 2063, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. For the next part of our discussion, I will very briefly be sharing some perspectives on behalf of the Under-Secretary General, Cristina Duarte, who unfortunately could not be with us due precisely to the United Nations AU high-level annual meetings that are happening also at the same time. I will share perspectives on her behalf before we then hear from our distinguished panelists, after which also the floor will be open for contributions from participants here based in New York, as well as some who are online. I would like to just briefly introduce our panelists. We have His Excellency Ambassador Kalilu Totangi, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us and for your leadership on these issues. We are joined online by Her Excellency Marie-Antoinette Rose-Catt, the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism. And thank you so much for being with us late in the day, and we really appreciate your participation. We'll be joined also online by Dr. Hanan Mossi, who will be connecting shortly, the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at ECA. And we have with us also in the room a distinguished professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Dr. Teddy Sami. Thank you so much for being with us. So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as already underlined by the Deputy Secretary General, there can be no sustainable development without sustainable peace, and we cannot deliver sustainable development also without sustainable and predictable financing mechanisms. It is critical that we develop strong country systems that allow African countries to precisely shape their own direction and to be able to fully mobilize and control their own economic and financial flows. The ability to channel these resources is crucial towards strengthening the ability to deliver durable peace. Durable peace is achieved when services are available to citizens and when the state is present throughout its territory. The overarching theme of our two reports are two sides of the same coin, that we cannot achieve peace across the continent without the presence of the state and without the institutions and architectures that allow the state to be present, including the financing architecture, both at the national level, the regional level, as well as at the global level. Our two reports confront the reality that the reality of the absence of the state in the continent, where institutions may be present in form, but absent in function. The financing gap is huge at $1.6 trillion US, and we must be able to rebuild this, we must be able to address this gap through the reinforcement of the presence of the state. Allow me to focus on a few key priorities that must be underlined. National systems, strong country systems, are essential for what we might term as fiscal sovereignty, the ability to control these economic and financial flows. And in the report, particularly on the architectures of financing for development, we have identified the opportunity for additional mobilization or equivalent to 13.6% of GDP. We must also look to our regional frameworks. And in the African continent's context, this means using the architectures of the African Union and its associated institutions, including the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also the opportunities for African countries to learn from each other through peer reviews, as well as the strengthening of Pan-African financial institutions. These architectures will also strengthen the capacity for regional architectures that can deliver on durable peace. We cannot achieve these changes without support of partnerships and support through the reforms of the global architecture. One of the biggest challenges which was outlined in Sevilla was the lack of predictability in terms of access to affordable and predictable forms of finance. The Sevilla outcome nonetheless represents a significant step forward, and where African member states played a key role in underlying the importance of domestic resource mobilization, and also on the role that partners can play in reinforcing the capacity for domestic resource mobilization across the continent. Finally, we must ensure that we complete the circle, in that the state presence is only possible if we reinforce the institutions that allow the state to be present for its citizens. This means addressing the legitimacy of state institutions, their ability to deliver services, their ability to deliver security and peace. The erosion of this capacity leads to fragility, and this is documented extensively in the report on the causes of conflict, which we are discussing today. So, Your Excellencies, dear friends and partners, we thank you all for the support in developing these reports, and we also look forward to working with all of you in their implementation, and in particular towards strengthening the ability of African countries to develop the institutions that allow these strong country systems that are intrinsic to delivering sustainable development and sustainable peace. I look forward to the continued engagement on these subjects. So, dear friends and partners, after these short remarks that have been delivered on behalf of the Under-Secretary General, we would now proceed to the presentation of the reports. And I will be introducing the first part of the report, and I would just ask that it is put up on screen. And the second part of the report, so the first part of the report will underline the interlinkages between the two processes and the two reports, as well as the main messages from the report on the promotion of durable peace, and this will be delivered by me. And the second part of the presentation will be delivered by my colleague, Mr. Kava Katumize, the Senior Economic Affairs Officer and Team Leader at Osaa'S, sitting to my right, and he will deliver the key findings on strengthening the national and international architectures for financing for development. We can go to the first slide, thank you. So firstly, the two reports underline a value chain of sustainable development in Africa, one which has been described by the Deputy Secretary General in her opening remarks, and which position the role of sustainable financing as a critical component towards strengthening the capacity of states and their institutions as agents of change, which are essential for durable peace, which are in turn the critical component towards allowing those states to also be agents for sustainable development. This must be enabled by a development-focused international financing architecture, which is also premised on the principle that African countries should have control over their own economic and financial flows, recognizing that the legacy of colonialism has often meant that African countries are dependent on the export of extractive resources with minimal capacity for value addition. This conceptual framework underpins both reports and is critical towards finding the solutions for addressing strong country systems and the architectures that are needed for financing for development. Next slide, please. Looking more specifically at the report on the promotion of durable peace through sustainable development in Africa, we can go to the next slide, please. Firstly, we have shown how the state is at the center of development. The report has underlined that the absence of the state is one of the biggest drivers of conflict and insecurity. We can see that in terms of the trends in governance performance, there is a marked difference between countries that are currently facing conflict, which is the lower part of the slide on the of the graph on the left, and the states in Africa which are not affected immediately by conflicts, which have seen progression. That progression needs to be accelerated, but nonetheless the trend is positive. Whereas in conflict-affected states, the erosion of the state fuels further conflict and leads to further erosion of sustainable development. We have also mapped the key indicators for state presence, which are the security and rule of law, the rule of law and justice, the capacity for public administration, accountability and transparency, and human development. And again, we can see the differential between conflict-affected states and non-conflict-affected states. Next slide, please. We have also mapped in the report the misalignment between government delivery and citizen satisfaction, and we have seen marked increase over the last 10 years. And in particular, one of the challenges of the absence of the state in Africa is disillusionment among marginalized groups, in particular women, youth, and rural populations and ethnic minorities, often excluded from public services, economic opportunities, and political participation. This increase in this misalignment and the widening gap further drives instability in conflict-affected states, but also means that even states that are making gains, that those gains are often very difficult to sustain. Next slide, please. As part of the report, we have also used a work that has been done by UNDP on mapping journeys to extremism and underlining what are the drivers of instability, and in particular the drivers of the reasons given for joining extremist groups. And what is very striking is that the two largest drivers are firstly employment opportunities and then also following influences of friends and family. So at the heart of this challenge means that the lack of income earning opportunities, particularly among marginalized groups, leads to rising extremism and the undermining of the capacity of the state. Conversely, investing in the capacity of the state to reinforce the ability to deliver employment, to get employment opportunities, and to translate this as well into investment into sectors that allow the generation of these employment opportunities is critical for the reinforcement of the trust in the state in the longer term. Next slide, please. We are also seeing that unconstitutional changes of government are often preceded by periods of intense dissatisfaction with the government. And we are seeing increases of the percentage of the population reporting that levels of corruption have increased a lot or somewhat over the past years, increasing quite dramatically in the period between 2014-15 and 2021. And the percentage of the population also reporting that the current government is not successfully handling or resolving violent conflict. Again, the infrastructures for justice, the institutions that are available for dispensation of justice, particularly also outside of metropolitan areas, is often a big challenge. And the ability, therefore, for the state to be seen as dispensing its resources in a fair manner are absolutely one of the most critical components in the lead-up to unconstitutional changes of government. Next slide, please. There is often sometimes the presentation of a security and development trade-off in the context of African countries, where it sometimes may be seen that there is excessive investment sometimes in security or in, let's say, military spending. The reality is that the presence of the state does involve being able to deliver security, while at the same time ensuring that development investments pay off. There are obviously very high returns for investments in peace building and prevention, and the estimates have shown that in countries not affected by violence, the dollar spent on prevention yields between $26 and $75 in savings. Those returns are even more pronounced in countries with recent violence, where the returns can reach as high as $103 per dollar spent, $103 per dollar spent. So in regions that are at risk of violent extremism, the preventive spending has reduced state losses by 2 to 8% of GDP annually. And doubling peace-building expenditure between 2017 and 2027 in the 31 most conflict-affected countries could have yielded savings that are in the trillions. In the context of Africa, we have also very briefly touched on in this report, but it builds on other work we have done elsewhere, on effective measures that can be taken sometimes in conflict-affected states to reinforce the presence of the state. Interventions such as school feeding programs, as an example, are ways in which the state can be present while also bringing immediate development gains and rebuilding the trust between the state and its citizens. To conclude the discussion on the causes of conflict report, we can move to the next slide, where we have to address the decline in trust in state institutions. And this leads to the role of strong country systems, which will also be discussed in the context of the financing for development aspect, but through the lens of resource mobilization. What we are seeing in African countries is that the popular trust in institutions and leaders is eroded. And we can see, particularly in the graph on the right, the erosion based on surveys between 2011 and 2023 in terms of three main branches of government. Addressing this erosion in trust means being able to demonstrate that development can reach all citizens, that security is attainable and it can be delivered even outside of the main metropolitan areas, and that African countries can properly harness their own resources to invest for the benefit of their own citizens. Obviously, this report has many dimensions, and we are only covering some of them, but I hope this gives you a very quick snapshot in terms of the key findings and the means as well by which we can rebuild state institutions and the presence of a strong, effective African state. Kava, I now have the pleasure to hand over to you to present the report on financing for development, and particularly relating to the architectures at the national, regional, and global level.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. Excellencies, colleagues from the UN system, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kava Kachomose, and I will be presenting the key findings of the report on NEPAD. Now, this report advances three key messages. One, mobilizing adequate financing for Africa's development depends fundamentally on building capable and effective states, anchored on sound governance and robust institutions. Two, given the small and often fragmented nature of African economies, deepening regional integration and strengthening the regional financing mechanisms are essential to complement national efforts in mobilizing development finance. Three, African countries are integrated into the global financial system, whose role determines the continent's access to finance and the cost of capital. Therefore, reforming the global financial architecture is critical to creating a fairer system that supports Africa's development aspiration. So those are the key messages from this report. After my 10 minutes of presentation, if I confuse you, at least you can take these 3 key messages. Now, the financing needs for Africa's development are quite immense. As the director mentioned, the financing gap for Africa's to finance the SDG is estimated at 1.6 trillion. Of course, the financing gap varies across countries. Nigeria faces the largest absolute shortfall of about 86 billion. But when we look at the financing gap as a proportion of GDP, Burundi is the most constrained, with a financing gap equivalent to 129% of GDP. Now, what's driving this? The report identifies 3 factors. One, shrinking fiscal space, declining official development assistance, and the weak institutions. Now, let me talk a little bit about tax collection efforts. Over the past decade, African countries have made progress in mobilizing tax revenue. And we can see from the chart above that the tax GDP ratio increased from around 14.1% in 2010 to 16% in 2022. However, this is below the average for other developing regions, and it is inadequate to finance the region's financing needs. And one of the persistent challenges to tax revenue mobilization has been the high cost of tax collection in Africa. But on that score, Africa is also making progress. We have seen the cost of tax collection declining from 9.5% in 2018 to around 1.4% in 2022. Now, how can governance support tax revenue mobilization? The report identifies 3 key areas, what we call the pillars of strong institutions. These are economic governance, digitalization of tax administration, and integrated national financing framework. Currently, investment in digitalization is still relatively low compared to other regions, yet the potential gains are quite immense. The IMF, for example, estimates that by adopting tools like e-invoicing and electronic fiscal devices, Africa could raise revenue by about 0.7% and 0.5% of GDP, respectively. Now, our report also shows that if African countries take coordinated action across these 3 pillars, they can increase tax revenue by up to 9% of GDP, which is quite substantial. The next slide. Strengthening governance and investing in digital systems is also important for strengthening African countries' capacity to prevent and curb illicit financial flows. However, too much emphasis is often placed on the importance of official development assistance as an important component of development finance in Africa. But in reality, the tax revenue lost to illicit financial flows are far greater. For instance, in one African country that we studied, the amount lost to IFFs in 2022 was 3 times higher than the money received in ODA in that same year. Now, by simply stemming illicit financial flows, this country could have generated more than triple the average amount it receives in ODA. That's why digitalization is so important. It strengthens transparency, accountability in financial system, making it harder for money to leak out unnoticed. Now, sustainable financing also depends on how well the domestic financial system is able to channel credit to the private sector. Now, as we see in the graph, African countries are constrained in terms of accessing domestic credit. As you can see there's a wide gap between Africa and the rest of the world. The average domestic private sector, your banking credit to the private sector for Africa is around 22% compared to a global average of around 58%. The small nature of African economies and shallow financial markets also limit access to long-term financing. Therefore, African countries need to strengthen regional financing framework to pool resources for investment in national and transboundary projects. And increasingly, Pan-African banks and regional and sub-regional development banks are beginning to play an important role in facilitating cross-border investments and providing trade finance. However, regional and sub-regional development banks are poorly capitalized. If you look at their lending capacity, it averages around 37 billion compared to over 200 billion for the Asian Development Bank and 112 billion for the Inter-American Development Bank. The last chapter of the report, next slide. The last chapter of the report looks at the reform of the global financial architecture. Some interesting work by Moyo and others highlights how the current financial system disadvantages Africa through limited ways and representation, limited access to long-term financing, and the high cost of capital, which aggravates Africa's indebtedness. Now, if we look at the interest payments by African countries, you can see clearly that Africa is paying more to finance its debt, currently around 18%, which was only around 12% in 2015. That means resources that could be allocated to investment in priority sectors such as health, education, and infrastructure development are now allocated to debt financing. And therefore, the need to reform the global financial architecture in line with the vision articulated by our Secretary General to ensure increased access to long-term financing, reducing the cost of capital, as well as addressing the issue of external debt. Finally, the report provides a comprehensive list of policy recommendations delineated at domestic, regional, and global levels, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight a few. We underscore the importance of building strong institutions, including through investing in digitalization, in order to unlock additional financing for Africa's development. This is a key recommendation also that came out of the Sevilla commitment of the 4th International Conference on Africa's development. There is a need to strengthen Pan-African institutions and regional development banks to ensure that they have adequate financing to finance important projects at both domestic and the international levels. But also more important is the operationalization of the African Union key continental financial institutions. In 2004, the AU agreed to establish key continental financial institutions, including the African Investment Bank, the African Central Bank, the Pan-African Monetary Fund, to unlock resources for investment in regional infrastructure. However, these institutions are yet to be operationalized. And I think there is a need for African agency to ensure the speedy operationalization of these important institutions. In conclusion, sustainable financing for Africa's development will hinge crucially on effective states with strong governance systems and institutions, strengthen regional integration, and a fairer and equitable international financial architecture that supports Africa's development aspiration. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Kava, for that presentation, which I think has really outlined some of the key action areas that have been identified. And I would now like to immediately go to our speakers, starting with His Excellency Ambassador Kalilu Tutangi, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations. And Your Excellency, to start us off, the report identifies that the functional absence of the state is the driver of conflict, which creates vacuums. And a key recommendation is to build state legitimacy through nationally owned development. We know that Sierra Leone has made some very significant progress in terms of Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And from your delegation's perspective, what would be the immediate priorities for national governments, but also with the support of the international community, in being able to particularly operationalize this, to extend effective state authority and empower an African state for development?
Thank you very much. Let me also thank the Office of Special Advisor on Africa for the launch of the 2025 flagship reports, strengthening the national and international architecture for financing for development, and the report on promotion of durable peace through sustainable development in Africa. You have in your presentation outlined the nexus between peace and development. And in the prior program where I was, one of my colleagues did compare development. He said, peace is development. And that's what he said, because the things that we have mentioned today, for instance, the disillusionment of marginalized groups and how things of that nature, the lack of opportunities drive especially young people in the hands of extremist groups, and how this together hamper development. My delegation would like to make the following points. That one, that post-conflict institution reconstruction is most sustainable when nationally owned, inclusively designed and strategically aligned with regional and multilateral frameworks. What we are talking about here our country came back from war some 2 decades ago, but some of the things that we did following that were basically based on advice from the World Bank, the UN organs, and things of that nature. What worked for us, in our view, is that we looked at our situation holistically, and the things that we implemented, including the advice on the Well, first it was the Millennium Development Goals, then it was the now what we have. What that did for us is that we looked inwards. One of the things that we had difficulty was with the resources that we had as a country were not well managed from within. So we said the national commitment and implementation strategy in strengthening public institutions, policy frameworks, and domestic resource mobilization was key in enabling national development in our view. We also said governance reforms showed the importance of combining justice, reconciliation, and institutional strength in peace building. Efficient financial structures are crucial for promoting inclusive growth, peace, and resilience without development strategies. What that means is that we built like a NACIT, the National Social Insurance Trust. We built the NRA, which is the National Revenue Authority. We had to build all of these institutions which have guided us through our development process. Even now, we have the National Development Plan for 2030, which also combines fiscal resilience and increasing domestic resource mobilization, which is a requirement for governance reforms, payroll digitization, stronger anti-corruption efforts, and improved tax administration. Creating national development banks for sustainable development with crystallized transformative growth and domestic development for African countries will set benchmarks for implementation aligned with national development priorities. Finally, we decided that there was a need to turn our commitments into real results by working together sincerely and taking shared responsibility for advancing national development while also collaborating with the international community. This is the approach that we use following our civil war in our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And we particularly take note of the criticality of nationally owned development. And you have, I think, very well outlined that link between the planning aspect and the institutions, and then the ability to deliver based on the strengthening of those institutions, which is very much centered around the ability to mobilize resources. And I would just like to highlight one thing that I really saw myself in what you said was the development of national development banks. And we can have very good institutions at the continental level. If we cannot translate them into institutions at the national level for the empowerment of citizens through and linked to nationally defined priorities, then that will be something that will be very difficult to translate in terms of investment, because in the African continent we are starting with often informal economies, and it is through development banks, national development banks, that we can allow a lot of this informality to actually become, to progress into sectors that allow a full mobilization of resources. I would now like to go online and to invite my compatriot, Her Excellency Marie-Antoinette Rose Kat, the Chief Executive Officer of the African Peer Review Mechanism. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'd just like to highlight to you that the report identifies that there is where there is a weak social contract and the absence of the state, then this drives conflict. And given the mandate of APRM, in particular the use of tools like country reviews to move governments from diagnosing governance gaps to implementing politically sensitive reforms needed to rebuild state presence and deliver for marginalized citizens. So how do you see the role of APRM in terms of strengthening this ability of the state to be present?
Good morning, colleagues, Your Excellencies, and my dear brothers, Kava and Jean-Paul. And I bring you warm greetings from Johannesburg. First, allow me to congratulate the UNOSA for these two very critical reports. Critical because of the timing, but also critical because they very much align to the reports that we have produced, the APRM. In particular, the AGR report of 2023, which speaks to unconstitutional change of government an AGR report of 2025, which is a critical analysis of how we are managing the natural resources, in particular land management, the blue economy, and the extractive industry, mineral extractive industry. Now, as you know, the APRM, we publish a lot of reviews. We've been producing reviews, 26 reviews, 32 reviews now in 26 countries over the last 22 years. What we've seen, and I'm very happy that, this is one of a few engagements I've had during this year that speaks to the triple nexus, not just on peace and development, but on peace, governance, and development. Because in everything that we're doing, be it in peace and security or development, governance is the foundation upon which everything else rests. So I think we need to continue to encourage the narrative and the conversation around the triple nexus, not just a nexus between peace and development. When you look at the reviews that we've published, the challenge for the continent and the APRM has, we're sitting on a lot of information. We know what needs to happen on the continent. We know how, we know the what, we know the how, but we've not really managed to implement the recommendations successfully. So what we've done at APRM, we've looked at we've published an impact assessment report. So after 20 years of the existence of the APRM, what has been the impact? And when you look at governance trends across the continent, there's been a decline, a clear decline in terms of governance. And because of that, then we have had to look at what are the critical interventions to address this gap. So there's a clear gap between recommendation and implementation. So in addressing this gap, we've introduced a governance support program. And the governance support program will be a game changer for the APRM, because we need to just simply accompany the member states in terms of implementation. And I'm very happy that my dear brother, ambassador of the Republic of Sierra Leone, made the first intervention, because Sierra Leone is one of the countries that we really have been supporting, and we're seeing the changes. For example, as we speak, we are in Sierra Leone now doing the second generation review, which is a base review. But more importantly, there's a lot of emphasis on reform in the public sector and public service delivery. And we are already seeing the positive outcomes. So what we've seen is when there's political will, where member states have really made an effort to implement the recommendations, we've seen a positive change. Obviously, we've seen the complete opposite, where there's been a complete absence of not just an absence of the states, but as you have so rightly pointed out, institutions that are not performing, institutions that are not really making sure that, they are present, they are engaged not only with the state, but the non-state actors as well. So the reports that have been launched today, that have been produced, are very much aligned to all the reports that we have produced as well, the AGR 2023 report and AGR 2025 report. And someone just mentioned, marginalized groups. I was in the company of 500 youths over the last 2 days. So the next AGR report will really be a very good analysis on the youth dividends on the continent. I will stop here, Jean-Paul, just to give you an aperture of how the states, when they intervene, we have observed a very positive outcome. And hopefully later on I can intervene on the key critical interventions that we're going to implement, or we are implementing as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And this, the tool of allowing African countries to consult each other and derive recommendations for implementation for the purposes of building inclusive institutions. There's already a practice, and I think this is very well documented by APRM and demonstrated in the answers that you have shared with us. And the critical aspect, as you have pointed out, is that to further document these best practices, to link the result to the recommendation, and underline how this can allow African states to build on that positive trend. And I would like to emphasize that the reports do obviously underline the great risks that we face for the African continent, but the reports do also underline, in particular, progress where it has been made, as well as the huge opportunity. And I think that lies at the heart of the investment in governance and institutions, which can allow the youth dividend that you have mentioned to be fully realized. And Africa's youth are absolutely critical towards achieving all of the ambition that has been expressed through Agenda 2063. Our next panelist, Dr. Hanan Morsi, has a little delay, so I will be coming back to her later. And I will now go to Dr. Teddy Sami. Dr. Teddy, first of all, the report has underlined the regional dimension. And the regional dimension is important to complement domestic efforts geared at mobilizing financing for Africa's development. And how can the regionalization contribute towards mobilizing increased financing for development? And what specific measures do you think that African countries can take? What specific measures can be taken by African countries, but also by the African Union and other regional institutions towards achieving this goal?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for the invitation, you and your team. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. If you are in different time zones, my name is Teddy Sami, as was mentioned. I'm a professor and currently the director of the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. I want to thank the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa for the opportunity to share some of my thinking and to address financing for development, illicit financial flows, and debt. I will do this in reverse a little bit and maybe speak about the broader financing for development agenda, and then briefly discuss domestic resource mobilization, in particular taxation, and then briefly comment on debt and IFFs, but at the same time address some of the regional and global dimensions of these issues. I think the first thing that we should recognize is that these issues are all connected. So if we strengthen national financial systems and the financial architecture, we can address financing for development, reduce debt, and also limit IFFs simultaneously. So I see regional and global cooperation as necessary and complementary to what we do at the domestic level. And I think one of the reports which talks about the presence and role of the state is particularly important because clearly the role of the state matters. States have the ability to collect revenue and to also decide how to do it. So in that respect, I think it's important for me to congratulate the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa for launching these two very important reports that in a way complement each other, because you can't have peace without development, and peace can also promote development at the same time. As these reports argue, Africa is indeed at a pivotal moment. We have a changing geopolitical environment that has led to shifting international priorities. Resources for financing development have become more constrained. Pressures on public finances in donor countries and thus reductions in official development flows will likely persist in the coming years. So this means we need to adapt to a new reality where aid plays a smaller role going forward. Several major donors, including my own country, Canada, have already announced significant cuts to their aid budgets. Canada recently announced a $2.7 billion cut in aid spending over the next 4 years. And these countries have also indicated that they will increase defense spending at the same time. So it's not a good time if you work on development finance. A recent report from the OECD projects a significant decline in ODA to sub-Saharan Africa from 16 to 28%, and also a significant drop in health funding. But if we look more broadly beyond ODA, so official development assistance, what we also know since 2015 is that the billions to trillions agenda has not materialized. As a result of, and the result of this is that there's been limited progress towards the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So let me then turn to DRM and taxation specifically. I think the outcome document of a Financing for Development conference rightly makes the case for strengthening domestic resource mobilization systems that go beyond taxation and considering other private sector mechanisms, pension funds, and better fiscal management. So we need to think beyond simply taxation and look at a comprehensive approach where the private sector is more involved, but also innovative finance. All of these are done with a view to improve state legitimacy, which come out of one of today's reports, to build a better social contract between citizens and the state. So while my focus today is mostly on finance, I should note that I particularly enjoyed reading the report on durable peace through sustainable development, because it echoes a lot of the findings that we know from the fragility literature, which is that countries can actually become more resilient and exit fragility traps if they build legitimacy and capacity to deliver political goods. So state-society relations matter. And in fact, what is interesting in the African context is that despite the fact that we've seen democratization in some places, better transitions towards democracy, what has not really happened and leads to instability very often is this inability of leaders to deliver for the people. So if you don't deliver social services, you don't deliver political goods to the population, then you will have instability. It reminded me of all the protests that we are seeing right now, the so-called Gen Z movement, which is really this feeling that they are being left behind and they are not receiving what their leaders have promised. So I think this is a really important moment. As international financing for development becomes more unpredictable, mobilizing resources will of course be important. My dear friend Kava just presented some of the findings from taxation, but I think we need to look at these numbers very carefully. So there are three things that we know from the data. Tax to GDP ratios have improved, but there's a lot of variation across countries if you look at the data more carefully. The other finding is that the average continues to lag over regions. So even though there's been some improvement, Africa is still behind other regions, including developing regions. The third thing is that the main source of tax revenue for most countries is taxes on goods and services. And then you have a few others, in particular the resource-rich countries, where taxes on income, profits, and capital gains tend to dominate. The reason I mention this is because tax to GDP ratios are important, but perhaps even more important, which we don't see in the data, is what we call tax effort. So that's a different measure, which is the ratio of how much you collect compared to your potential tax share, which is a different way to calculate, to examine the ability of countries. And if we were to do an analysis of this tax effort, probably with the data that we have today, we will probably find, as we have in the past, that some countries are already making a lot of effort to collect taxes, but others are not. And so we have to be careful, and here I would like to offer some additional comments that build on today's reports. One, I think how you collect revenue matters as much as how much you collect. So it's not just a question of trying to raise tax to GDP ratios, but it's also how you do it. So which taxes do you prioritize? Do you go more indirect? Do you go direct? And context here will obviously matter, and so will the structural characteristics of specific countries. So if you're resource rich or not, the levels of informality that exist in your economy, and so on. My point is that as economists, what we are always worried about is that if you raise taxes too much, you will create a disincentive for firms to invest. So we need to find the right balance. So we need to pay attention to the design of tax systems, how you administer them, the tax mix that you decide to choose, and also fighting corruption in tax administration, avoiding tax exemptions which make no sense, and so on. So I think the design of how you actually generate revenue through taxes is as important as how much you're trying to collect. The second issue I will raise is the issue of ownership. I think donors in particular have to align with domestic priorities and incentives. So they must continue to invest in knowledge and sharing platforms. And one example of this is the African Tax Administration Forum, which does a fantastic job. And I think these are the kinds of initiatives that we need to put more resources into, especially at a time where we're trying to make every dollar count. The third thing I would say is donor coordination and the high transaction costs that result from too much fragmentation. I think in the past, when you look at the evidence, you will see that donors tend to adopt a herd mentality where everybody flocks to the same place and they impose a heavy burden on partner countries in terms of coordination. So I think division of labor among donors would go a long way, as well as the expected payoffs that we would want to see from interventions. And finally, given the importance of state legitimacy and the social contract, I think we need to have a discussion of tax issues beyond the technical capacity, but also broader issues like independent policy research, public outreach, and engagement with civil society. And that includes also the media and private sector, because we need to mobilize efforts so that people understand why it matters. I think in many cases, people don't want to pay taxes because they don't trust that the government will return something to them. So I think there needs to be a broader discussion around why this matters. And so you need the public outreach and engagement. And so briefly on the issue of debt, what I would say is, if we look at the lessons of previous initiatives such as HIPIC and the MDRI, what they did, they reduced debt levels, but not enough attention was paid to the root causes of debt accumulation. One concern, for example, right now is that current mechanisms to restructure debt are taking too long. So they are too slow. In my own experience, given some recent work that I did on Zambia for UNECA, it was clear that the process took too long for Zambia to get to a point where its debt had been restructured. And so debt restructuring needs to be much faster. It has to involve all the creditors equally to ensure that there's a fair treatment. But to complement that treatment, I think what is needed, despite the fact that resources are limited, we need to have more access for concessional financing windows so that countries do not accumulate unsustainable debt again. So we need the full range of innovations in terms of financing instruments, and that includes things such as green bonds and debt swaps that are not being used enough in the African context. And finally, on the debt issue, I would say that in the case of global public goods, I think we need to realize that the private sector will not invest in general, or at least not alone, when it comes to GPGs. So you need more active involvement of the multilateral or development finance institutions through concessional windows or blended finance. And here I would say that the MDBs in particular could leverage the balance sheets much, much better than they are currently doing. They could do this more efficiently and broaden their lending instruments. In the interest of time, I will very briefly talk about illicit financial flows because I think this has been fully covered in previous reports by Osaa'S. I would direct people to the, I believe it was 2022 report by Osaa'S on illicit financial flows. We all know what the issue is. I think what we really need to do is to start implementing some of the recommendations that have been put forward. The final comment I would make in this case is to really continue the work that is being done at the UN level to push for a UN Convention on Tax and Financial Transparency. I think this can go a long way to addressing this issue because countries in Africa will not be able to do this on their own. We require regional and international collaboration. Thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you very much, Teddy, and I will actually come back to you afterwards with some follow-up questions. So, because I think some of those things need to be expanded on. But the first thing I would just like to underline is that you have said that it's not just how much you collect, but it's also how you collect. And this, if I may extrapolate, is directly linked to, therefore, the economic model. So taxation and domestic resource mobilization are also intrinsic to the financial planning, the economic planning that countries need to make, because you need to be anticipating not just where you are, because where African countries are, they are in an extractive loop, but it's also where you want to be and how you structure your tax system accordingly. And I think the Africa Group, particular Africa Group of countries here in New York, have done a fantastic job as part of the global negotiations on tax cooperation, because for African countries to be able to mobilize their own resources, it involves also challenging the partners that are trading with African countries, and where African countries are losing so much in terms of trade misinvoicing, trade mispricing, transfer pricing, and these can be addressed. There are some components that are within the power of African countries that I think Teddy has outlined very, very well. And there are some aspects that link to this cooperation aspect and where partnership is required. And sorry, I've touched on only one part of your very rich comments, but I thought that this was, and this is linked to the IFF's, of course, conversation. I would now like to go back to Her Excellency, the CEO of APRM, Ambassador Marie-Antoinette Rose-Quatre, to link in a little bit more into these questions on regional mechanisms, because I know APRM has led, for example, the launch of the African Credit Ratings Agency, which is going to be based in Mauritius, if I'm not mistaken, and is going to be operational very, very soon. And in particular, in the report, we have underlined that African countries, and one of the examples cited in the report is that the default rates on infrastructure projects in Africa are actually the lowest in the world, lower even than in Europe, the default rate. However, the cost of capital doesn't reflect the practice. The cost of capital is still based on the risk perception. And therefore, regional initiatives through, for example, an African credit ratings agency can help precisely having more of these Africa-driven processes to allow for a fairer approach. So, Ambassador Rose-Quatre, maybe we could get your perspectives on how AFCRA can really help African countries address their needs in terms of financing, and how this links in with both domestic institutions and other regional institutions.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Before I get to AFCRA, perhaps I would like to explain our strategic interventions in light of both reports. The question we have been asking at EPRM is, what do we have as a continent? I think it's very important to just take stock of what kind of resources do we have. Now, we know that we have the natural resources. That's very important. And second is our human capital, so our human resources. And the third question is then, what do we do with these two resources? How do we then manage these two very important critical resources? This is why out of AGR 2023 on UCGs, we have seen, and the UCG report points to one of the drivers of conflict being the mismanagement of resources. So this is why we've published the AGR report of 2025 on the management or mismanagement thereof of resources, especially critical minerals across the continent. Out of AGR 2025, we have also observed that, in 2023, that one of the drivers of conflict is how then we are managing the human capital, especially the around 750 million young people under the age of 35. And this is why AGR report of 2027 will examine the youth dividends on the continent, and how in the age of artificial intelligence, et cetera, do we then ensure that the vast resource we have and the youth dividends are properly managed. And this is very important for the APRM and for the continent. Now, how are we then managing our economies? This is the third question. How are we have all of these fantastic resources. How are we managing our economies? And what we've observed is that the continent has enough domestic capital. We have enough capital on the continent to borrow and to lend to each other. So I've looked at the figure of $1.6 trillion in illicit financial flows, and capital outflow is the biggest challenge that we have as a continent. Our money, what we have, it's sitting in banks in Europe outside the continent. So basically, we are putting money outside the continent, and then probably we are borrowing the same money at a higher rate. And why is that? Because we have three dominant CRAs that have been assessing our economies, that have been assessing our member states. But first, none of these three dominant CRAs have offices in Africa. They're sitting somewhere outside the continent, in London, in Hong Kong, and they've produced a lot of reports on our continents that we feel do not really reflect the realities of Africa. I'll give you an example, and I use this example all the time. When there is a protest in Nairobi, it is seen as a risk. But when there's a protest on the streets of Paris, it is called democracy. So, and because of this perception, then, we feel that a lot of our member states have been unfairly rated, given the fact that we do possess a lot of resources. And as you have so rightly pointed out, when you look at the continent, we do have enough resources to support each other. So the African Credit Rating Agency, and I've heard a comment that, there's a lot of initiatives taken by the African Union that have not yet materialized. And I'm very happy to say that the African Credit Rating Agency will be operationalized. It will not give a favorable rating, but it's meant to give an alternative opinion in the marketplace of opinions as far as credit ratings are concerned. So this is going to happen next year. Now, what we do at the APRM, we're not going to only operationalize AFCRA, but we support member states in the area of credit ratings. And perhaps you don't know, Jean-Paul, but there are 21 African countries that have never been rated. So the big challenge for the country is expertise, is competence, is the ability to really prepare ourselves well for credit ratings. And we've supported about 8 countries this year. And next year, we will be targeting around 10 countries to specifically intervene, build capacity, prepare these countries, support them so that they're better prepared when they are being rated. And what we found is that the economies can absorb, have the ability to really perform well. But it's just that a lot of these countries don't have the capacity to put statistics together. They don't know how to prepare themselves ahead of a review. So this is what the APRM, this is the kind of interventions we've been doing in a lot of member states. And it's very important because it speaks to how then do we get more capital, how then do the sovereigns, sub-sovereigns, and corporates can access credit. And we don't have to access credit outside the continent. There's enough capital within the continent for us to access credit. Thank you, Jean-Paul.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Marie-Antoinette. And I think, first of all, we are seeing a very strong determination from African countries to change the direction and to strengthen institutions, and as illustrated by the examples that you have given. And I think that what came out very strongly also in Sevilla was that African countries, it's not only that African countries in a way don't have a choice, because this is a reality of the world that is there today, but there is also an understanding among African countries that they have to reclaim this narrative, and that the narrative is about the empowered state and the ability of the state to control its own resources. And I think that the efforts that are being made and the examples that you have given as well about linking the management, for example, of natural resources and the harnessing of Africa's youth dividend is absolutely essential, because it is about jobs. If we go back to the report, it's about jobs and opportunities. And if we continue to have extraction of resources which concentrates wealth, we don't solve, it's not a question of solving, we do not empower that opportunity that is directly linked to Africa's youth dividend, and we don't also change that perception. We do not understand how, we cannot demonstrate how Africa that is expressing itself democratically is the Africa also that can claim its full and fair share of its own resources. To go back to you, Teddy, the follow-up question, therefore, from the previous conversation would be, what, if I might say, from an economic model perspective, what are the key decisions that African countries need to take to be able to better situate themselves economically, to precisely break that cycle that you've described between relatively the low tax effort versus potential, and simultaneously as well, this boom and bust cycle, which is also directly associated with debt. How do we break that cycle from the level of the state? What are the key decisions that need to be made?
It's obviously not an easy question to answer, but I knew you would ask me these difficult questions, and I think we should be addressing them. So I just want to go back to this issue of tax effort for a moment, because in the analysis that we and others have done, it's very clear that countries that are heavily reliant on resource revenue are the ones who tend not to make enough tax effort. So the incentive system for them is such that they collect more revenue from their natural resources, so they don't have an incentive to go and collect taxes elsewhere. And I think it speaks to this issue of a social contract as well, because if you're not taxing your citizens more broadly, then it breaks that social contract in a way, because you're not then required to deliver for the people, and the people don't expect anything from you. So it's the classic sort of fiscal pact argument, right? So I think, for countries that are heavily dependent on natural resource revenue, there is a need actually to diversify away from those. To go back to your comment about job creation and so on, because we know that in many cases these are heavily capital intensive sectors. The benefits don't necessarily, go to the broader population, and so you have an incentive in a way, if not an incentive, but you have every reason to diversify your economy so that you're not heavily dependent on natural resources. And we also know what the consequences of this is if you don't do it, which is the volatility in prices, etc. Right? So it's not revenue. It's not revenue that is guaranteed. And on top of this, now we're talking more and more about a green transition, which will have implications for countries that are heavily dependent on oil revenue, for example. So it's a complicated issue, but I think countries in Africa that depend heavily on oil, for example, should be looking at. Now, the other part of this, and I think some of the work that has been done on this by people who look at structural change, will argue that one of the challenges in the African context is that many countries have missed the middle. And what I mean by this is that we've seen a transition from agriculture to the service sector, much of which is informal activity, not as productive. It employs a lot of people. It's pushed a lot of people from rural to urban areas where they end up in low productivity informal sector activities. But we haven't seen the kind of industrialization that we saw in other places. And so what does that mean for a continent where you have a very young population? The median age is extremely low, but you have a young population that will look for jobs in the next few years. And so if you don't have industrialization, where will these jobs be created? So I think there's a real question there about the need for African countries to industrialize as opposed to deindustrializing, which is what we have seen over the last few years. So yes, you can have agriculture, which is a big source of livelihoods for a significant number of people, but you also need to think about industrialization, and you also need to think about how to make the service sector more productive. And so the final comment I would make about your question is that I think in a way this ties back to the issue of resource mobilization, because if many of these sectors remain informal, so too much agriculture that is not captured by the state, too much in informal sector services, again not captured by the state, then how are you going to build a social contract? And I think this is where more work needs to be done in terms of how we can formalize and create better jobs for the millions of young Africans who will be looking for jobs in the future. So you need to think about this sort of more comprehensively, not just through the lens of taxation, but also through the lens of structural change and the creation of jobs to make economies more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Teddy, and thank you again to Ambassador Marie-Antoinette Rose-Catt. I would now like to, and I would like to perhaps come back to you both perhaps a little bit towards the end, because we have got some additional questions, which I will share now, because we have an audience following us on YouTube, and some of the questions which have been posed are, what is the protection framework that we should install in Africa to strengthen governance, transparency, and anti-corruption? Secondly, what models of political accountability and citizen participation will be most effective in Africa? Thirdly, which links a little bit to some of the points you've just made, Professor Teddy, what strategies can help diversify African economies beyond raw material export? Fourthly, how can Africa build competitive manufacturing and also digital industries? So some interesting questions that are coming from our online audience. But I'd like to open it up to the people in the room for any potential speakers who would like to intervene and share their perspectives, either in terms of comments or questions that they may have. I believe we have the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination from DESA, Ms. Bjorg Samkjær. Apologies if I mispronounced, but over to you, ASG, to share your perspectives.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I would start by, wishing everyone a good morning and good afternoon to those online, and really thank Osaa'S and the panel for this incredibly rich discussion, very substantive and pointing to very, very important questions and issues for all of us in the UN system to grapple with as we move to the last 5 years of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think these two reports can really help us move forward on and doing the right things as we move forward. I think, the reports that we've had presented today are very important reminders that financing for development is critical to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in the context of the growing financing gap in Africa that I think you documented so well in the reports that were presented, and that we've had a good reminder that financing is about more than just financing flows, but also about getting policies, incentives and institutions right. And we talked about the global levels and the regional levels, but you've also really highlighted the importance of the national level to mobilize those resources that we need for sustainable development. You've made the important linkages with conflict and the importance of peace. That we heard the triple nexus mentioned from NEPAD. And the approach, I think, that you've highlighted here has also been reflected in the recently adopted Sevilla commitment, which many of you have referenced, and which we at DESA, of course, work very closely with member states, as well as with you and other partners to both get adopted in July, and I would like to congratulate member states on getting a quite strong commitment to financing to development there, but also in that commitment to follow up with that renewed global framework for financing for sustainable development, and including in that what I heard from Professor Sami, that commitment to a global framework convention on tax. And I believe the experts are meeting right now, as we are here, the experts are meeting in Nairobi to hammer out exactly what that framework will look like. It's not easy, but at least we have that commitment to having that important framework and to translating that into important domestic resource mobilization, the way that you talked about. We've also just come out of the World Summit for Social Development in Doha last week, which again I think re-emphasized the importance of the social contract, which many of you also mentioned, and I think that the reports here speak to so well. So there are lots of issues here that I'm very tempted to touch on. I won't do that in the interest of time, but let me just again congratulate you on the reports, on the importance of having this knowledge and the evidence base as we move forward to implement important commitments from Sevilla on financing for development. You mentioned such important areas that are critical for Africa's development: investment, debt, reform of international financing architecture, institutional and governance reforms, also reflected in the Sevilla commitment, and again, important commitments coming out of the social summit. So let me just end there by stressing DESA's commitment to working with you and working with member states to strengthen institutions and capacities on financing issues such as tax and integrated financing frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ESG, and allow me to also underline how you have, I think, shown through the points that you have highlighted that within the UN system there are very important discussions and framings that allow us precisely to address the issues that I identified in this report. And you referred to the Sevilla outcome, where a lot of these issues around tax are covered. But I'd also like to highlight a point which I think has not yet come up in our discussion, which was that the Sevilla outcome also underlines that in terms of development aid, one of the best ways to do so is to actually support domestic resource mobilization. And it's called for a doubling of DRM in terms of from development partners. And this corresponds to what African countries are asking for. They're asking for strengthening the capacity of the state to mobilize their own resources. And this is then again directly related to the work happening on tax, which you have referenced, which is happening straight away. And this is not, this is also essential to delivering on the social contract, which is part of the discussions that have taken place in the World Summit on Social Development. So while we are in, I think it is fair to say, a very difficult moment for multilateralism, the most critical issues for Africa can only be addressed also if we continue to make those efforts through these processes. So thank you for having underlined that. I think I have a request from UNCTAD to take the floor, but if there are others, if you could please raise your hand so that I have an idea and we can make sure we cover everyone before we close. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Juan Jose Martinez Badillo from UNCTAD.
Thanks. Thank you, Jean-Paul, and thanks to colleagues, USC Duarte, and to the panel. I think it was a very interesting conversation, and I would like to refer particularly to the second part of the report, the Financing for Development one. And I think a number of the recommendations or conclusions of this report line up with the outcomes of UNCTAD's research. However, I wanted to kind of add two layers of issues that we have perhaps not yet found a solution to, or that we feel that we need to dig in a bit more to realize exactly what to do on that. And one is particularly, I saw that one of the recommendations that the report had was to prioritize DRM, and I think this has been let's say, a broad cross-cutting issue of the work of UNOSA, and the attracting private finance. And I think, you know, we all agree on that, and there has been some talk of saying the scale of the resources that we have to mobilize to fund the SDG is so large that we cannot only depend on public finance, we will not be able to mobilize those level of resources. And even the IMF argues that there's a limited capacity of states to actually be able to absorb a number of those resources without creating financial instability in terms of the growth that can happen to public resources and to public expenditure. However, we do feel from the perspective of UNCTAD and from our research that to start there might not take us anywhere, because we come into a chicken and the egg kind of situation. Do you need to mobilize DRM to reinforce the state, to create to attract private finance, to spend on infrastructure and so on, or do you actually need institutions to create the conditions for growth to be able to mobilize more DRM? Because at the end, we're talking about high levels of already considerable levels of tax burden, and without generating growth, then the fiscal base will not be expanded, and therefore the capacity to generate additional DRM is limited. So are we talking of a chicken and the egg kind of situation where we have the chicken and the egg and we want to know which one is which, or are we talking of a catch-22 kind of situation where neither of the two moves because we're not going there? And we do feel that the need is for a national public push to be able to generate a number of the conditions on infrastructure, on conditions to attract investment, and the institutional setup. And perhaps that's where the international push to help that national push comes in. Because the danger is that when we focus on DRM, then we think the onus is on the developing countries to generate it on their own without the international support measures, the international intervention that will do it. And I think we agree very much in terms of the comments that were made on debt in particular and on the need for a timely mechanism to address debt restructuring and to allow countries the fiscal space to be able to do this kind of investments that are needed. I think in particular the numbers that came up in terms of the cost of capital for the cost of debt and the cost of capital in general from developing countries are very telling. It lines up to also the research that we have had, and in terms of the CRA work, the credit rating agencies work, and this is one of the streams of work coming out of Seville, but also coming out of the Pact for the Future. Our research actually corresponds to what you are saying. We have countries, in particular African countries, with very favorable conditions that are facing high cost of capital, countries with similar fundamentals that are facing very different credit ratings, and countries with similar credit ratings facing very different cost of capital. So something's wrong in the system. And the initiative to give a different opinion through the African credit rating agency is welcome. We do feel that there's more that can be done beyond that, and we do see that the capacity of countries to generate their own data, so that it's not just an opinion, but it's data that cannot be disputed, that is one of the elements that perhaps makes for a more favorable cost of capital in cases where there is perhaps an unfavorable opinion by the major credit rating agencies. So just a couple of layers of how we have been unpacking this issue, and thank you very much. I appreciate very much the discussion, and congratulations to UNOSA colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, JJ. And I will not attempt to answer your question fully because it is vast. But I think one of the things that does come up, and the panelists may come in with some further perspectives, but one of the things that comes up in the report is that, yes, not all African countries are at the same position anyway. So there's not a one-size-fits-all. But what is common to all of the countries is that they do need support in reinforcing their institutions. But as you have said, simultaneously, we need to address the conditions of growth. And this is linked to the industrialization imperative. And the industrialization in Africa will only happen through intra-African trade, but also how that intra-African trade feeds as well into global value chains. So it's regional value chains, it's national value chains, regional value chains, and global value chains, and strengthening Africa's position relative to those aspects for generation of growth, which then improves the perspectives for domestic resource mobilization, because if you have more growth, you can theoretically then gather more of those resources. But you need the institutions in place. And yes, we end up with a chicken and the egg, but it is also, in a sense, we have to do everything everywhere all at once. We have to also recognize that the obstacles are very deep-seated and are linked in many cases to the legacies of colonialism, and therefore, that is of course a very simplistic thing to say. I would not say that covers all of the arguments, but if we don't recognize some of these obstacles, then we can't solve them. And that is, I think, one of the underlying aspects of the report. I'm sorry, you've been very patient. Your Excellency, over to you on my left. I'm sorry, I don't have your name immediately to hand, but
Sure.
you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm the DPR at the Mission of Namibia and currently chargé d'affaires. Let me sincerely congratulate OSA for this achievement, to be able to launch your flagship reports, and thank the panelists for their excellent interventions this morning. We do appreciate the great work that OSA does, and we want to touch on some elements from the reports. We do concur with the central argument that achieving durable peace and sustainable development on our continent hinges on strengthening national, fiscal, institutional, and governance capacities, supported, of course, by an enabling regional and international system. We want to highlight that in this instance, it's important for Africa to look within, and you mentioned the AFCFTA And there are so many other areas that we could look into. One of those key ones is domestic resource mobilization. And Namibia recognizes the paramount importance of having robust systems in this regard. So while Africa has made significant progress in advancing trade integration, attracting FDI, and strengthening regional and multilateral economic ties, illicit financial flows remain a challenge. A number of studies has been done on this. We do, however, need to enhance evidence-based responses, and with the initiatives such as the Tax Justice Network Africa, that is supporting enhanced capacity to help identify the policy gaps and tracking reform progress. I think we need to acknowledge that and support that work from all fronts. I believe the OSA reports highlights that Africa, the illicit flows number around 80 billion or so annually from Africa, which is a huge number, staggering number for resource-rich continent. I think some of these numbers are so critical in terms of if we can turn this situation around, it would help significantly the development trajectory on the continent. For years, our continent has been trying to engage governments, in particular Western governments, where some of these resources have landed due to, of course, some corrupt means. However, there is a stance to, of course, acknowledge that these resources belong to the people on the continent. And however, the situation is that these resources are still kept back by certain institutions in Western countries where these flows have gone to. So our question to the panelists is then what can be done really to finally address this phenomena, because it's been going on for years, and this is much needed capital in the context that Africa is having challenges to get the necessary capital for development due to some of the elements that have been said in terms of ratings and so forth. The risk of doing business in Africa is so much higher, or the cost of doing business. So if we can turn around this phenomena of illicit financial flows in terms of returns thereof, I think it will really help and address these concerns. So my question again is to the panelists: what can really be done to fully address this issue? I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for those perspectives. And I will not take too much time because we want to make sure we hear back from the panelists to be able to answer precisely those questions. We have one more request from the floor, which is my colleague Jackie Sek, who is from DPPA, but you can perhaps fully, sorry, I know you work with the ASG, so perhaps you can fully introduce your organization before you ask your question or make your intervention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for this introduction. And thank you to Osaa'S for this very timely and interesting panel. I learned a lot by listening to you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jackie Sek-Diouf. I am the chief of the African Union Partnership Unit in the Office of the Assistant Secretary General for Africa, ASG-POBE, for the DPPA, DPO, so the Departments of Political Affairs, Peace Building, and Peace Operations. So it is a mouthful, so it's long to say. I wanted to take the floor because Jean-Paul will know that we had our first official meeting last week since I took up this new function. Of course, being in DPPA, DPO, my focus is on peace and security issues, and support to the African Union from that perspective. However, as was mentioned earlier in the day, today there is a meeting of the annual conference between the Secretary General and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. This meeting is being supported by my office and is a way to bring together the three pillars. Throughout the discussion today, this morning, and this afternoon, the principals will be discussing the three joint frameworks that were adopted the one on peace and security, the one on development, and the one on human rights. So the linkages between those three frameworks are clear, and they have been highlighted also recently with the adoption of Resolution 79-329 on the UNAU partnership that was adopted by the General Assembly after 12 years of not having such a resolution. So the reason why I wanted to take the floor today was first to demonstrate loud and clear to my friend Jean-Paul that while my focus will be indeed peace and security as per the location of my position, I also would like to strengthen the work that we are doing with Osaa'S and colleagues with regard to the nexus aspects. With that in mind, I was struck with one of the comments. If I understood from the presentations and also in the concept note, one of the central thesis of all of the discussions today is that we need to strengthen the fiscal, institutional, and governance capacities to fulfill the social contract in order to be able to move forward. Now, from a peace and security perspective, we focus a lot on the institutional capacities. We focus a lot on governance, on the fiscal aspects with the work that we have been doing with Resolution 2719 on support to African Union-led peace support operations. We've been talking about resource mobilization for those operations. As you may be aware, the resolution is about getting funding from the assessed budget up to 75% and mobilizing the other 25%. So the discussion on financing for development and the domestic resource mobilization aspects that have been highlighted throughout strike a chord because, of course, when you're talking about support to peace operations, we also are talking about resource mobilization and how we can get the affected countries and the region working to provide that support. So my comment is with regard to a link that I had not thought of before today between the peace and security and development nexus. But then the question is, beyond the domestic resource mobilization, if the fiscal aspect is a central part of the nexus, if there is any advice from the panel on how we can strengthen that work in the peace and security world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And we really appreciate this very important question about the link between the resources and the peace and security, the ability to deploy in that context. We are running towards the end, and we have got our colleague, Dr. Hanan Morsi, the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist of ECA, who has now managed to join us online. Dr. Hanan, thank you so much for being with us, and we know you were taken away, so thank you so much. And we know it's late also in Addis Ababa, so thank you so much. If we could briefly hear from you, we know ECA has been doing a lot of work on the reform of the international financing architecture, as well as work on the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And from an African perspective, what are the most urgent reforms that we need to see from this international architecture? And looking in the context of the ASFTA, but more generally, how we can really empower African states to implement Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. So Dr. Morsi, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, JP, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I think I would say there are a few things that would be key and very critical to the advancement of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Among them is ring-fencing the important role of the multilateral development banks. And it's important to highlight that MDBs have played a critical role in providing financial flows to Africa. Just to give a sense, in 2023, 21 African countries would have ended with a negative total flows without MDBs. And thanks to the role that the MDBs played, this actually ended up being half only of these countries, only 11 countries ended up with the overall negative flows. So going forward, it would be very important to ring fence that role to make sure that they are well resourced, that their concessional windows are funded, and that also the type of financing that they do supports regional integration agenda. So all the work in terms of supporting regional infrastructure and connectivity, targeting more of local currency financing, and harmonizing operational procedure among MDBs to facilitate and accelerate disbursement would be very important. Also, crowding in private sector in terms of guarantees and de-risking instruments and blended finance. And for MDBs to play a role not just in the financing, but also in terms of supporting the development of the domestic capital markets and the regional capital markets. It would be key to advance and to enable the sufficient resources at affordable cost to invest in regional infrastructure projects. Also, a second important area is the need to advance cross-border payments, and particularly in local currency. And we estimate that having the Pan-African payment settlement system is going to save African traders about $5 billion a year. So, supporting the advancement of this cross-border payment system, investing in digital infrastructure, harmonizing regulations and interoperability will be key. And of course, to allow countries to really focus their efforts and priorities on what matters, including regional integration and Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030, it will be important and key to tackle the big elephant in the room, which is the debt issues. And here, there are a number of issues that we've put forward, including the reform of the G20 common framework in terms of suspending debt service upon application, expanding eligibility to include middle-income countries, ensuring a comparability of treatment formula, and having an integrated approach among official and private sector creditors, and as well also to make sure that we have the incentives set right within the debt architecture system to have incentives that encourage preemptive debt restructuring rather than just countries after hitting a wall. So all these things will be critical, and of course, among the things also on the regulatory side is the mainstreaming of the climate resilient debt clauses, which within the UN and within ECA, we've been working hard to advance that and to scale up also the innovative financing such as debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. So that's kind of in a nutshell the key things that would really matter in terms of the global financial architecture in relationship to regional integration and Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Morsi. And I appreciate very much that you've had to juggle a little bit with some other events. Just to conclude, I would like to hear back from our other two panelists, starting with Ambassador Marie-Antoinette Rose Quatre, to hear her perspectives, just some closing thoughts in relation to some of the questions that maybe have been raised. But I would particularly like to hear your thoughts in terms of the governance equation across the continent. What you would say are the sort of the priorities that we need to take away in terms of addressing this link between the citizen and their government, and therefore harnessing that youth dividend that you have spoken about?
Thank you, Jean-Paul. I think the answer is very clear. We just need a culture around good governance and democracy, and unfortunately, we don't have that in all of our member states. Some we're building the culture towards that. We're empowering civil society organizations, youth, etc., etc. And in some countries, I must say, we have actually reached that stage where there is a culture around democracy and good governance. Why do I speak about a culture? It's because irrespective of which administration is there in the country, I think that social contract has to be respected, and that revolves around the culture of respecting and first establishing very strong institutions. And we know that we need very strong institutions, but we need more than that. We need independent institutions. We need proactive institutions, and we really need a very engaging and active civil society. It hasn't happened in all of our member states, as you have so rightly pointed out. We are at different levels in terms of governance and democracy, but we need to reach a point where we respect the rule of law. We have strong institutions, and so that this social contract can be respected. Now, how do we achieve that? I think we've talked about a lot of things that we can do, that can be done, that should be done. We are at a phase, Jean-Paul and colleagues, where I personally feel that we're talking quite a bit and we're meeting quite a bit. And I think we need to really move to the next phase where we really streamline our efforts. I say that, Jean-Paul, because, for example, the APRM and UNOSA, we have streamlined our efforts. We meet regularly. We combine our efforts on the ground because it has happened. It happened in Sierra Leone. It's happening in Liberia, etc., etc. We combine our efforts on the ground, and we bring our resources together. And this is key in terms of implementing these recommendations. 2 fantastic reports produced, a lot of reports coming out of the continent from the APRM. We're sitting on a lot of information, and we know exactly what needs to happen. But I think we need to really move towards where we can combine our efforts, and especially on the ground where it matters. We have seen in many areas where there's been a dysfunction in terms of multilateral organizations coming together, and that dysfunction has rendered us ineffective on the ground where it matters the most. So we really need, and would very much like to propose that the next conversation is really then zooming in on how do we build a robust framework, especially within the AU and the UN, where we are together on the ground where it matters. And I really must commend UNOSA, UNDP, UNECA. We are there in a lot of countries, and Hannah, my dear sister, and the UNECA, we're really working together extremely well in all of our African countries as far as credit ratings are concerned. And this is what needs to happen everywhere, all the time, so that we can really see a difference and really impact and tangible results. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rose-Quatre. And thank you again also for sharing those perspectives. Teddy, if I can go to you just for, and if I could ask you to be 2 minutes, and perhaps tackling in particular maybe some of these questions around the link between industrialization, trade, and resource mobilization.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just very briefly, I just want to maybe go back to one comment earlier, which was on illicit financial flows. One thing I haven't really talked about today, but I think was mentioned, was the FCFTA. I think this can be a really good vehicle for accomplishing some of these objectives, like harmonizing tax policies. Customs is another one. To close some of these loopholes, to go back to your question about how we tackle this. Can think about joint, so for example, investigative teams across borders to look at illegal activities if we have a robust regional framework. I've mentioned the UN before, but I think at the regional level there could be better ways of harmonizing and working collaboratively. On the issue of industrialization, I mean, there's no question that the continent now is still trying to recover its growth momentum. I mean, we've seen low growth since the pandemic, and with the geopolitical situation now, it's really difficult, of course. But I think this reinforces this idea that you need to focus more on the regional aspect before thinking more globally. And I think, again, the FCFTA can be a really interesting vehicle for jumping on some of these regional value chains and working together. I mean, if you look at the Southern African region, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in, many of the countries have all the critical ingredients for building batteries, and they have all the green minerals, and yet most of the processing is not happening, right? It's being extracted, and so there's not a lot of value addition. This is just one example, right, where you could build these value chains in the region instead of allowing these resources to be processed elsewhere. You would create jobs, create growth, and you would create resources domestically that could be taxed in a way from these activities, because if you don't have economic activity, you can't tax, right? So these are just some of the ideas. And the final thing I will say, I will end on this, is that I'm still optimistic in the sense that I think African countries are resilient and they can adapt, but I haven't given up on ODA, and I want this to be clear to people. I think official development assistance, sort of a traditional way aid was provided, is provided, I think still matters. I've seen a lot of conversations lately around a post-aid world and the end of aid. I'm not in that camp yet, and it's partly because I think official development assistance can serve a really good purpose in terms of, investing in DRM. I think the chair mentioned, the Financing for Development Conference asking to invest more in that area. But then if you look at traditional finance for things like health and education, the private sector is not going to do this. So until countries are able to mobilize resources domestically and fund these programs, they will still require development assistance. So for example, we've built an entire ecosystem of health financing in many African countries. And I'm really worried because it's not just a technical issue, it's about people's lives that we're talking about, right? So when your health financing is significantly cut, and it takes you by surprise, it takes time for you to adapt. And I think this is what we need to be very careful about, not just give up on ideas. So while we focus on blended and concessional and innovative finance and so on, we should still be making the case for why ODA matters. And I think there's a case there to be made, even at a time when resources are limited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Teddy. Thank you again to all of our panelists, both online and in person. His Excellency, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone, Her Excellency, Ambassador Marie-Antoinette Rose-Quatre of APRM, Her Excellency, Dr. Hanan Morsi from ECA. Thank you once again for all your interventions. And now we will be having the closing statement from the African Union, represented by Myriam Oumala-Gauvin, the Senior Advisor to the Permanent Representative. Just before I give you the floor, Your Excellency, I would just like to acknowledge the team of Osaa'S staff that worked on the report, the authors, Kavazeo Kajomize to my right, Liwadin Fliss, who's over there, Utku Texos on my left, and Ndidi Anyag Bunam, who is somewhere over towards the back of the room. And also to underline the contributions of our two interns, Lishan Lunena Naisho and Munir Zime Mora Kapai, who also provided absolutely fundamental support for these reports. With that, and with those thanks as well to all members of the African group, to all UN partners, and also not forgetting the interpreters, I now would also like to hand over to our colleague Myriam Gauvin to close today's event.
Thank you very much, and good evening for the people online, and good afternoon for us here. Actually, it's not yet 12, so we're doing very well. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for this opportunity. And so I therefore would like to deliver the statement of His Excellency Mohammed Idris, Permanent Observer of the Permanent Observer Mission of the African Union to the United Nations. And I read, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, it's a distinct honor to deliver the closing remarks on behalf of His Excellency Ambassador Mohammed Fatih Ahmed Idris at the global launch of the 2025 Osaa'S flagship reports on strengthening the national and international architecture for sustainable development and durable peace in Africa. I would like to sincerely thank the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa for the impressive work reflected in these two flagship reports and for convening today's very engaging discussion. Our exchanges this morning have highlighted the following clear messages. One, financing for development and durable peace in Africa are inseparable. A resilient and peaceful Africa requires strong national systems, sound fiscal governance, and institutions capable of delivering services and earning citizens' trust, remaining the foundation for peace, inclusion, and sustainable development. The reports we launch today also offer a concrete roadmap, one that combines national ownership, regional integration, and international solidarity. They remind us that Africa's transformation will be financed primarily by Africa itself. But the reports also make it clear that a fairer and more inclusive international financial system is essential to make this possible. The discussion here is not only about financing, it is ultimately about justice and shared responsibilities. We have to bear in mind that we cannot achieve global peace and sustainability of Africa as it continues to face structural barriers to investment and credit rating. Reforming the global financial architecture is therefore both a moral and economic imperative. The African Union welcomes and commends the strong emphasis placed on domestic resource mobilization, tackling illicit financial flows, and rebuilding state capacity. These priorities are fully aligned with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Following the outcomes of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla, the African Union remains committed to continuing to work closely with OSA, the UN system, the international financial institutions, and all partners to translate these findings into concrete action to ensure that financing for development truly serves peace, inclusion, resilience, people-centered growth, and prosperity across the continent. I thank you once again, all the participants, for their rich and valuable contributions and their continued commitment to Africa's sustainable future. Thank you. Asante sana.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everyone, and wishing you a very good afternoon and evening for those connected online. We very much appreciated the conversation. Thank you very much.